checking to see what people are saying. Oh, you're in the chat as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I just opened it. I'll just have to turn the sound off really quick, or maybe I'll just close it. But sometimes it's nice for me to also be able to see the questions. So
yeah, of course. Yeah, there we go. So it looks like the stream is working. Yeah, awesome.
Great.
There we go.
Hey, everyone.
Yeah. So I'm here with Dr. Liz Jackson, and I'm guessing most of the people who are going to be watching this live actually already have seen you speak to, for example, like Cosmic Skeptic or T-Jump or someone. But for those people who haven't heard you talk before, do you want to just kind of briefly introduce yourself and your kind of background, so people have a bit of context there?
Yeah, just a second. I am having a sound issue.
Okay.
Because I think I opened the video.
Can you hear two of me? Is that your problem?
Yeah.
Do you want? Have you got a Chrome tab open?
Actually, I just closed the tab and it's still playing. Thankfully, it's playing through my headphones, so
right.
I don't think everyone else can hear it. I actually now think it's playing through Zoom.
Oh, okay. Do you want to try muting Zoom? Maybe mute me on Zoom. I don't know. Or if you're on Windows, maybe like Task Manager might show you if you've got a rogue process in the background or something.
Yeah, I'm worried that. Yeah, I'm almost sure it's playing through Zoom from you.
If you want. Oh, okay. That could be. Let me have a look. I don't think I'm not sharing my computer sound or anything with you.
Because I don't have anything open now.
Do you want to try?
Definitely still playing.
So I've got my microphone set up.
Oh, nope, it's still going.
No. Do you want to try leaving and rejoining? I don't really have any.
Yeah, I'll
sorry.
try that.
Okay,
that's okay.
No, we'll get this sorted, guys. Be patient, and then hopefully, little technical issue. Yeah, it seemed all right for me as well. So hopefully this will be a quick fix, and then we'll be able to get on with the interview. Hello, everyone in the chat. I hope you're all doing okay today. See Caleb, dry apologist, in there, Spartan Theology, and we can probably talk at some point as well, Spartan Theology. I think I saw your interview with, was it T-Jump or someone a couple of months ago? That was cool. I'll share this link out on Twitter for people as well. So, live with Dr. Liz Jackson. Admit. I think she should be coming in. Can you hear now okay? Have you got one?
All right, let's see.
One times audio?
I think it's working now. Okay, great. That was so trippy. That was like, I was just listening to everything with like a 10-second lag. It was very weird.
Was it all just like out of phase enough that it kind of like did that weird thing to your brain where you got, yeah.
Yeah, and I was like trying to listen to you, but I couldn't because there was, anyway, it was weird. Okay, I don't know what that was though, because I completely closed the browser and I had the video on mute too. So I don't know. That was weird.
It's a
anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, for those people who aren't familiar with your work or your kind of background, do you want to give them just a bit of context about what you've studied and stuff and what you've been working on recently?
Yeah, definitely. So first, I just wanted to say thanks so much for having me on. I'm honored to be here and looking forward to our conversation. So yeah, my name is Liz, and I did my PhD in philosophy at Notre Dame, and just actually finished up a postdoc, which is basically a short temporary job where you get to do research, which is great. So I did a postdoc at Australian National University, which is in Canberra, Australia. Although because of both the Australian fires and coronavirus, I actually was only in Australia for about half of the year, and the rest of the time was spent mostly in the US and a couple other places. But so I'm basically just finishing that and then starting as a assistant professor at Ryerson University, which is a school in Toronto. So I'll be teaching philosophy there and continuing to do research as well. And I'm really excited for that. So yeah.
And you've been kind of busy on the YouTube scene recently as well, haven't you? You've done quite a few interviews and things with people.
Well, yeah, I guess I started off because I did an interview with Cam at kind of a conference we were both attending. And then from that kind of mentioned I had an interest in Pascal's Wager, and then ended up doing a couple different interviews with Jordan Hampton, who has a video called Crash Course Apologetics. Right. A channel called Crash Course Apologetics. I've done a couple with him. And then I think, it really, I started, what I did a debate about Pascal's Wager. And then I think I started to kind of get more messages and stuff on YouTube. So yeah, but it's been really fun. And I guess just on that, I really think it's sad if only people that know about kind of new ideas and things that philosophers are thinking about are other philosophers. I think there's a lot of really cool work being done in epistemology and philosophy of religion, which are the areas I work in, but also in metaphysics and ethics and in lots of other areas. And some of this work actually has really important real life applications. And it's just sad when it's, like the everyday person hasn't heard of it or has no idea kind of what philosophers are talking about. So that's one reason I really like doing YouTube stuff. And I try to say yes as much as possible when people ask me to be on their channels, because I just think YouTube is such a great place to kind of connect what's going on in philosophy and in other academic disciplines. It can connect that to just kind of the everyday person. A lot of people are into YouTube and watch YouTube, and it's been really interesting for me actually to sort of get a taste of like this whole YouTube culture. Like it's almost like its own thing,
Yes,
so it's interesting.
Yeah, one of the philosophers I've interviewed, Don Loeb, I can never pronounce his surname properly, but he's a moral anti-realist. But he said after the conversation that he feels like it's his obligation to give back for some of the opportunities that he's had in academic philosophy, to kind of give back to the public. And I was kind of thinking, like a kind of moral obligation, is that? But
there you go. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's a moral obligation. It might be, but I think at the very least it's a good thing, Yeah. So yeah, that's great. Yeah, you've interviewed a number. Didn't you also interview like Michael Huemer? I think I saw.
Yeah, I've had in the past couple of weeks, I've had Michael Huemer and Russ Schaefer-Lando on as well.
Oh, great.
And Aaron Rabinowitz, who I don't know if he's done his doctorate, but he's definitely, he's got like a philosophy podcast that's relatively popular and stuff as well. So I think people in general on my channel are quite interested in the kind of moral philosophy side of things. Like I initially actually started this channel to do apologetics when I kind of started it, and now it's become sort of cross purposes. Like I enjoy doing the interviews and things. I also want to like make some educational stuff, and then occasionally I like like people like Jeff Durbin or Darth Dawkins. I like to kind of ridicule and mock their what I see as quite harmful beliefs.
I see. Yeah, I think it's great that like you're bringing people like Russ Schaefer-Landau and Mike Huemer onto YouTube, though, and I think a lot of philosophers would do it if they just got asked. Yeah. And I think also a lot of philosophers just don't even know about YouTube and like what's going on here and how many people you can reach through YouTube. And it's really cool, like with doing one video that will get like a couple thousand views. I mean, that could reach more people than most conference talks you would give, for example. So I think it's great. And I would love to see more people doing what you're doing and kind of reaching out to philosophers and getting them. I mean, I think Christian philosophy is great. That's super important, but also just like moral philosophy and like just learning stuff. I think you can learn a lot through interviewing people. So that's awesome.
I do worry though that if I get to people after T-Jumps got to them first, that they might have been put off and never come back to, they'll think when I say, can I interview you, that it's going to be, that they're going to get hit with like a Sidewinder missile or whatever.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Tom. Yes. He was super, super nice, but definitely, nice, but I don't know if you saw it, but he definitely brought up
challenging,
Pascals
right?
Wager, and I was like, oh wow, he just had this view that was like, we just can't know anything about who might be rewarded or punished in the afterlife. And I was like, whoa, that's not a view anyone's really brought up to me before. And it was an interesting conversation, but definitely a little surprising. Not one of the traditional objections to Pascal's Wager.
Yeah, he has some really, I think, interesting like objections that he made. Like, I don't agree with him on everything, but I really like the way he does think outside the box and stuff. Like, but I just worry that if people have like a discussion / debate with him, and then they get, like from professional philosophy and stuff, and then think, oh, I'm not going on that YouTube thing again.
Oh yeah. I mean, in some ways, I think it's cool to think outside the box, and that's actually like what philosophers do, sort of. But yeah, I mean, the importance is like being clear about what you're saying and being able to back it up. And I mean, I think Tom can do that to an extent. I think I don't have as much experience as you do. But yeah, the YouTube can definitely be a mixed bag, and also there can be some drama. Like apparently there was a bunch of drama last week. I don't really follow it that closely, but yeah, so yeah, anyway.
Okay, so to switch gears then, I guess, into the philosophy a little bit, and I thought maybe stop, because I don't know much kind of your theological background that you bring to this. Is there like a particular denomination of Christianity that kind of aligns with your metaphysical view, and so I kind of understand a bit more what, like if I was speaking to someone who is like, say a Calvinist, or someone who's a Lutheran or a Catholic, it kind of helps to understand what their metaphysics are, like a bit of a little bit. Is there a particular kind of branch you'd put yourself in or under?
Yeah, I would say broadly Protestant, and by Protestant I kind of just mean like not Catholic or Orthodox. I don't really align with this more specific denomination than that, and I wouldn't say I'm like a hardcore Calvinist or anything like that. And I guess I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, but if I had to sort of like summarize some of the things in philosophy of religion that I'm sort of interested in, one would be like faith, like what it is, and senses that it might be rational. And I'm interested in, I guess, faith in God is a big one, but I also think faith just plays a really important role in kind of interpersonal relationships too, and just our commitments in general. So that's kind of one big kind of area of research I'm interested in, and one thing that I think is important. And my research in epistemology is a lot about belief, and so I'm also interested in kind of the relationship between faith and belief. And then I have a paper that actually just came out where I talk about how belief and faith might interact with hope as well. So so that's kind of one area. And then the other area, which we've touched on a little bit already, is sort of Pascal's Wager. I just think it's a really interesting and potentially underrated argument for God. And it's not an argument for God's existence as much as an argument that you should believe in God. And I think there's a lot of really interesting things that the argument brings up. And I guess I should say too, I don't think my view is that there's a knockdown response to every single objection either. I think there are actually some really challenging objections to the wager that I don't know what to say about. But I think that a lot of people sort of dismiss it really quickly. And when you actually sort of dive into it more, I think it's a lot more plausible than a lot of people think. So in terms of like my interest in philosophy of religion, those are kind of the two major branches. And I actually think they're potentially related in some interesting ways too.
So to begin then, I guess if we talk, I think the word faith is one of the kind of weirder ones, especially as it applies to Christianity, because it's so I think universally misunderstood by I don't think there's any kind of it's almost like the term atheist in the set, like there's no sort of usage that everyone is happy to use. There's usage that people would want to use the word for like a rhetorical advantage in a debate or something, or there's there seem to be, for example, so some atheists who would want to say, well, it's it's evidence in things unseen, so it's what it means is unjustified belief or something like that. And Christians who would want to say, yeah, is that because that's the plain reading of the text? And there's some Christians who would want to say, no, it isn't that. It means trust. It's pissed. It's like, so how would you define? Firstly, I suppose how would you define that word? And also, I suppose you're going to have to touch a little bit on like how you draw that out of the text, I suppose, in a sense as well as the philosophy. So do you want to talk a little bit about that word faith, what it means to you, how you come to those conclusions?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you. I think faith is actually, in some circles, it's just like a dirty word. It's like believing without evidence, or believing something that you know is false, or whatever. And I guess like if you want to say that's what faith is, then that's fine. Like you can have the word faith, but I want to hear a reason like about why that's something that religious people or Christians have. And then I would just say, well, that's not what I'm talking about. That's not really valuable or important. And I don't really see that as like a fundamental part of Christian communities. That's not to say that like no religious person ever does that. I mean, we're all irrational in some ways, right? But I don't, if you just want to define faith as this irrational thing, then I'm just going to say, okay, you can have faith. I'll just use a different word,
Sure.
So that's the first thing to say about sort of the dirty word response. Yeah, in terms of just the definition of faith. So one thing that I think is helpful here is to think about the difference between faith and belief. So when you believe something, you sort of take it to be the case or regard it as true. So if I believe snow is white, then I say the world is such that snow is white. It's the case that snow is white. It's true that snow is white, right? And so I think faith is related to that, but not the same. And one difference between faith and belief is that when you have faith that something's true, that almost always involves some kind of desire for the thing in question to be true. And belief doesn't involve that kind of desire, right? So I believe like there's a lot of people dying of coronavirus, and that sucks. But I don't have faith there's a lot of people dying of coronavirus because I have no desire for that to be true. So faith has some kind of philosophers will call it like a pro attitude, some kind of you look favorably sort of on the thing in question, and belief doesn't, because belief is just saying like this thing is true, or like I have a bunch of evidence for it. So that's one difference. And then another difference, I guess some of these will be controversial, but I think some people think faith in some sense goes beyond the evidence in a way that belief doesn't. Okay. So faith might be steadfast in light of counter evidence in a way that belief isn't. Or maybe, I don't know, there's different ways of spelling this out. And this can get back to our first worry, which is, well, then isn't that just irrational? Okay. But I actually think there's a lot of really interesting and creative ways that people can make sense of the idea of going beyond the evidence without having to say that's automatically something that's irrational. So I think those are at least two important characteristics of faith. One, it kind of requires a desire for the proposition to be true. And then two, it sort of goes beyond the evidence. So you might think that there are cases where we have a bunch of evidence for something, so we believe it and we have faith in it, and then we lose evidence for it. And maybe we shouldn't believe it anymore, but we can continue to have faith in it. That's pretty controversial. Some people want to say, no, belief and faith always go together. But I'm open to at least the possibility of this kind of thing.
So like I'd say, for example, like my personal position is that of an agnostic, though I'm not saying that's what, some people might know, but I'm strictly saying like I don't know when it comes to those conclusions. And now when you're talking about faith here, though, are you kind of, you're saying you don't really have to have knowledge, but it's, like someone could technically be like an agnostic Christian, for example, would be a legitimate class where it's saying, but I hope in these things, even though I don't know. Is that kind of what you're getting at there?
Yeah, no, this is great, because I think this is actually something that a lot of people aren't totally clear about, or even these terms get thrown around and are confusing. So I want to say we need to distinguish between three different things, and I'm glad you brought knowledge in. So there's knowing, there's belief, and there's faith, right? Knowing is going to be the strongest. So when you know something, you believe it, it's true, you have justification for it, which philosophers debate about what exactly that means, but a traditional understanding is kind of good evidence for it. And then there's a fourth condition, which we don't need to get into. This is getting into some high level epistemology stuff, but something about like the environment that the belief was formed in has to be correct because of these things called Gettier cases. And some people will know what those are, but I don't know if we need to get into that. But anyway, the point is that knowledge is belief plus truth plus justification plus something else. So it's this like pretty strong state. So then there's belief, right? And your beliefs can be true or false. Your beliefs can be rational or irrational. Maybe I should give some examples here. So back in the day when everyone thought the earth was flat, A lot of people, maybe different, like a peasant that worked in a field. Sorry, I'm going to turn do not disturb on because I don't want to get distracted by text messages. Sorry about that.
Right.
So a peasant that worked in a field, in a field back in the day, they had a justified belief that the earth was flat, but that belief was false. But, you know, given everything they knew and all their evidence, clearly supported this belief, the earth is flat, right? Or like maybe a more simple example, consider like an upset in sports, like a really bad team beats a really, really good team. Before the game, you probably have a justified belief that the good team will win, but that belief ends up being false, right? So you can have justified false beliefs. You can also have unjustified true beliefs. So if I shake my magic 8-ball and say, is it going to rain tomorrow? And the magic 8-ball says yes. And so I'm like, oh, it's going to rain tomorrow. And then it does actually rain tomorrow just by luck. That I didn't check the forecast or anything. That belief it's unjustified, but it's true, right? So sorry, I know maybe I'm getting too much into this, but the thought is you can, when you believe something, it can fail to be knowledge because you don't have justification or because you don't have truth. So you kind of need both of those elements. So that's just to say that knowledge is a much stronger thing than mere belief. And then part of the thought is, I guess, faith is sort of stronger than belief in some sense, but weaker than belief in other senses. It's stronger than belief because, like we talked about, you need that desire when in belief you don't. But it's weaker than belief in that maybe you don't need quite as much evidence to just have faith, right. Like say that God exists rather than believe that God exists. So
sorry to you know, on the, so if we were talking about like belief is the easy one for examples, and maybe knowledge might be more difficult, but things like I exist or whatever. But outside of say belief in a God, would you say faith then this word faith has like a usage that for the more kind of skeptical atheist types who might be listening in the audience that they'd be able to relate to? They'd be able to say, I kind of agree with that. So is it's not necessarily just this kind of other thing that Christians have, so maybe they can relate to what you're saying here about the word faith in some sense. Are there some examples?
This is controversial, but I'm pretty open to that. So and I know that was your original question, but I also wanted to kind of step back and clarify knowledge, faith, belief. What are all those? So yeah, I'm pretty open to the idea that you could have faith, even if you don't believe, even if you are kind of an agnostic. And so like, what does that look like? Like, how is that even true? Well, the way I think about it is you think, look, if God existed and I sort of chose to be committed to God, that would be a very good thing. It would be a very good thing to sort of pursue this relationship with God if God existed, even though I don't think I have enough evidence right now to believe that God exists. I still think I have this desire for God to exist, and I still think it's at least sufficient, like it's at least a live possibility, or kind of, it's not super unlikely. So, if I probability 0 to God existing, that's not going to happen. But even if it's like really, really low probability, probably still pretty difficult to have faith. Maybe you could have hope. We can talk about that. Right. But to have faith, when you assign the probability of God existing like 1% or something, that might be trickier. Okay. But I think if you think like there's a pretty good chance God exists, I don't know if I straight up believe it. Like the problem of evil is hard. The problem of divine hiddenness is hard. But I think you can be totally rational and sort of committing to God. And I mean, then there's tricky questions like, when do you count as a Christian? Or like what, like when, what's required for salvation? I think those are hard, but I think you're definitely on the path to Christian commitment, if not in some ways, like fully a Christian. And I think at the very least, I would want to say you can have faith. You can have faith that God exists even without that belief. So I know this probably isn't going to be popular among everyone, and philosophers are totally divided on this, and some think, sure, no, you need to have that belief to have faith. But part of the reason that I think this picture is pretty attractive is because it shows us how we can kind of have faith even when we experience serious doubts, or we encounter kind of really intense counter evidence against some commitment that we made. So if you think about a person who kind of started off with a Christian commitment or a commitment to God or whatever, but then gets a bunch of counter evidence, a bunch of evidence that God doesn't exist, Some people might just say, well, you're doubting, so you're out, like, because you're doubting, you can't be a Christian anymore. Some people have even called this the path from doubt to getting out. But I want to say, like, no, like, we can undergo very serious doubts and nonetheless sort of be rational to continue in that commitment. And that's kind of one of the things I think faith enables us to do. So there's a bunch of other sort of arguments for this idea that you could have faith without believing. But that's kind of one of the ones that I think is really important, is that just because you're encountering doubt doesn't mean you have to give up that commitment.
So I guess, what have you seen there's kind of this popular video clip of, is it John Lennox and Richard Dawkins in debate, where Richard Dawkins says something like, well, we don't need faith. And John Lennox says, well, don't you have faith in your wife? And it's quite popular as like and Richard Dawkins goes, yes, of course I do. And John Lennox goes, well, there you go, you have would you say that something like our use of the term faith in like a relationship, for example, would be something perhaps universal that everyone could see, like that would be the same sort of faith, the same sort of way in which you're using the word when it applies to philosophy of religion, say? Do you think that is because, and then I suppose within that there's also typical sort of, say, the atheist experience with Matt Dillahunty, as someone would say, well, I have all sorts of evidence of that I have that relationship with my wife. I have the fact that we live together, or this or that, and so it's demonstrable. It's not a faith-based position. What do you think about the kind of discussion around that? Is that an example of something that maybe people who aren't Christians could relate to, as something that is faith-like they might have in their life? Or
yeah, no, those are great. So yeah, I'm very open to the idea that there's sort of some kind of unified concept of faith that can apply both to faith in God and to faith in other people. It's not going to be the same in every way, maybe, obviously, but maybe this is like a super Protestant way of thinking about it. Like, Catholics might be like, no, that's like the wrong way to think about a relationship with God. But yeah, in my view, as a Protestant, I'm very okay with thinking about God, our relationship with God, as analogous to kind of our relationship with other people. And so yeah, I think we can give a unified, so what the things I was just talking about, where faith requires a desire for the proposition in question to be true, and faith requires some sense of going beyond the evidence, I think those apply to both. So, like, here's an example. You might be in a situation where your spouse is accused of committing a very serious crime. Maybe like your spouse is accused of murder or something. And it's not like they have perfect evidence for it. So it's not 100% sure your spouse committed this crime, but there is some evidence mounting against your spouse. Maybe someone saw them at the scene of the crime, or maybe they don't have a good alibi or whatever. So it's kind of a case where the evidence is a little bit ambiguous, but there is some evidence against it. And you might think, well, look, I can continue until that evidence is like fully conclusive against my spouse. I can continue to have faith that my spouse didn't commit this crime. And in this case, I think it could actually be similar to someone who continues to have faith in God, even though they get some counter evidence against God's existence, right? So, if someone gets so much counter evidence that they think the probability that God exists is 0 or very close to 0, that would be like a case where someone has like a videotape of your spouse murdering the person or something, But I think in cases where we get some non-decisive counter evidence, I think that's in both cases, in the spouse case and the God case, you could continue in your commitment to that person, to God or your spouse, and you could continue to have faith that, God exists or your spouse didn't do it. So in that sense, the question isn't, does your spouse exist? It wouldn't be like that.
Sure.
But it's still a case where there's kind of a proposition that has a lot of interpersonal weight that can, I think, go beyond the evidence. So I guess that's kind of what I would say to someone like Matt. I would say, well, we need to think of, these other cases too.
So like in that case, and I think this is quite a pertinent question, that if you're familiar with any of the kind of things that street epistemologists would talk about in some of their conversations with people, it would often be to say, if someone were talking about faith in that relationship sense, they might say, well, at what point would you kind of leave that faith in your wife in a relationship? Like for example, is there like a marker that would reduce your confidence to something? So if they had good evidence that their wife had been abusing the children or something, then it's like, well, that would be evidence for me to leave. Is there some kind of agreed upon point at which someone should abandon a belief in the face of evidence or something like that, or should the person continue to hold on no matter what? And I think that these are really deep, difficult questions, and questions, anyone who's been in a relationship as well, where that like I'm sure we've had like relationships where they've come to an end at some point, and it's like, at what point do you make that decision and decide, like I think this is where that philosophy might kind of apply, is there much thought given to that, at what point someone kind of would leave a faith or anything?
That's a really, really good question. So there's a lot I want to say. I guess the main kind of core of the answer I would want to give is that I really think you can model this with decision theory.
Okay.
So I think it depends on sort of the stakes, like with respect to the propositions being true, the stakes with respect to the propositions being false, and then like how likely you think that proposition is, right?
Okay.
So like in the spouse case, if you have faith, I'm trying to think of an example because maybe the murder example isn't great, but maybe like something that doesn't, like there wouldn't be high stakes, like if you're not worried about your spouse like murdering you or abusing your children or something.
I know, stealing money or something like that. Maybe.
Yeah, right. Yeah, maybe your spouse is just accused of stealing money in like a non-violent way, right?
Yeah.
Because the stakes are a lot less high if you're wrong about that, then the thought is you can kind of hold on to that commitment for longer, even when sort of you get more evidence that they actually stole the money, because there's not as much to lose there. But yeah, if it's something like your spouse was like abusing children or murdering people or doing something that could threaten your life or your children's lives or whatever, then yeah, I think because the stakes are high, I mean, it's going to depend on how high, like how good would it be if you continued in the commitment and your spouse was innocent versus how bad would it be if you continued in the commitment and your spouse was guilty. You kind of have to weigh those against each other, but depending on how those weigh against each other, then you'll actually get the result that like you need the probability will be much higher for when it's rational for you to leave. So basically you can't kind of persist in the face of counter evidence as much. Right. So now I want to say, well, let's think about this is like this is why I like Pascal's wager, because I think there's an asymmetry with the risks. Okay, so when you think about, well, what if God exists and I continue in this commitment? That's a really, really good thing, right? Potentially infinitely good, but people probably that have seen my previous stuff know that I like infinities, but you don't even have to say it's infinitely good. You can just say it's really, really finitely good. But then if God doesn't exist, if God does exist and you continue if God doesn't exist and you continue in this commitment, you don't have as much to lose. I mean, you could argue you have some things to lose. You'll maybe be making moral sacrifices you wouldn't have made otherwise. And this is going to depend on the religion you're practicing and how you're practicing it too. But the thought is there's some kind of asymmetry in the risks there that's kind of more like the spouse and the money case than it is like the spouse and the child abuse case, for example. So that's why I think what I think is really cool about Pascal's wager is that it kind of brings out this practical asymmetry between theism and atheism that I think is a really compelling reason to pursue a theistic commitment.
So perhaps this point then might be a natural segue into the more Pascal's wager wagery side of the conversation. Maybe before getting into your version that you've been working on, would you be okay to kind of lay out the historical version by Pascal and the Pensees initially, and maybe talk about some of the shortcomings you see in that as well, and some of the developments then on top of that you see to be made today with what we know now.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm not a historian, I'm not an expert on this, but I mean, I've read the Ponce and I've read some of the historical stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, the basic kind of original argument is like this: look, there's two ways the world could be: God exists or God doesn't exist. And there's sort of two actions you could take. You could believe in God or not believe in God. If you believe in God and God exists, you have either infinity to gain. I think I was probably the original version was, you have a ton to gain and infinity to gain, but you could also do it in terms of, like I said, a large finite amount to gain.
Right.
If you believe in God and God doesn't exist, you don't have a ton to lose. Whatever you gain or lose is finite, or at least if they're both finite, it's a much smaller value than what you would gain if you went to heaven. And then if you don't believe in God and God exists, you could be annihilated, which I guess would be like a 0, or you could if there's hell, that could be like something negative infinity. And then if you don't believe in God and God does not exist, again, it's a much smaller value, a finite value or a smaller finite value. And so the thought is, sort of just given this risk reward structure, it's rational to believe in God. That's like the most basic version of the argument. I mean, we can also talk about sort of specifics with Pascal's version, because I think some historians think that Pascal had actually sort of narrowed the possibility space so that there's really only two live possibilities: Christianity and atheism. Sure. And so he had kind of ruled out the many gods worry from the beginning. Yeah. But, kind of that's more of a more historical thing. But yeah, I mean, basically a lot of people then worry, well, what about competing religions? What about Christianity versus Islam? And if you're a Christian and you believe in God in a Christian way or practice Christianity, but then Islam turns out to be true, you could still go to hell, and vice versa. And so I guess there's a lot of different ways that I sort of want to update this argument. But one way that me and some friends have worked on updating this argument is basically by just including the various religions in the decision table, and then offering ways we can kind of compare those religions with each other.
And would you say, sorry, that is the main the strongest objection to the original sort of version of the argument that doesn't apply to your kind of reformulation and improvement upon?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because, again, like, it depends on if you mean original, like what Pascal was arguing for, and then if you think Pascal had ruled out all the other religions from the beginning, then it wouldn't apply to his version. But I do think in terms of like a classical statement, or like maybe what you would see in like a philosophy of religion textbook, this is definitely the strongest. Might not be, I mean, maybe the strongest, but it's definitely the one that people bring up right away. I think it's one that causes people to dismiss it very quickly. But I think it's also important to see that, at least in my view, this isn't a devastating objection. You just need a way to sort of compare these different religions by sort of looking at what they claim about the afterlife, but more importantly, looking at the probabilities of them. And so, I mean, the main thing that we kind of push, I have a paper on this, is that we need a wager on the religion, and I've said this a lot on YouTube, but that you take to be most likely to be true. Okay. And that's because that's sort of how decision theory works. It takes as an input the way you think like what you think probabilities are. And from that, it can tell you how to be rational, sort of given you assign the probabilities in that particular way. So I actually think this isn't a huge problem for the wager. I know a lot of people dismiss it as a result of this, but I think there's actually some pretty intuitive ways that we can get around it.
So do you want to then get into how would you sort of lay out your version of the argument then? Are there some important considerations, maybe mathematically, in how we're modeling and thinking about this to start with, or how would you best articulate that to try and help someone understand the reasoning behind this?
Yeah, good. So I think there's at least two sort of classes of objections that I think would be really interesting to talk about. So the first sort of category of objections would be sort of these more technical mathematical ones that have to do with decision theory and infinities. And if you saw my discussion with Cosmic Skeptic, these came up a lot. And I think there was sort of a disconnect there in what I was trying to say and what he was taking from me. So that's sort of one category. And then I think the other category is sort of how these relate to sort of important questions in traditional epistemology that are going on right now that have to do with whether you can form beliefs like on the basis of Pascal's wager, and then if you can, like whether those beliefs would be rational or irrational. So I don't know. I mean, if it's okay with you, maybe we could sort of talk about both of those.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're really different in some ways, but I've sort of been thinking a lot about both. So so in the first case, the thought is, well, if Christianity offers you an infinite reward and Islam offers you an infinite reward, and you can't have both, they're mutually exclusive, you have to practice one or the other, then if you sort of take this naive view where you just multiply infinity by the probability, and then you say, and that's just infinity, then it looks like all the religions that kind of have heaven and hell as part of their doctrine are going to have the same expected value. So the probabilities won't matter. And then, so then you might say, okay, well, at least we shouldn't be we shouldn't be atheists. We should practice a religion. But that isn't actually true, because there's this very small but potential possibility that atheists go to heaven and theists go to hell. You might think that's crazy, but you, according to sort of the rules of how you're supposed to assign probabilities, you shouldn't assign it a 0 probability. You should maybe assign it a very small probability if you think that's unlikely, but you shouldn't assign it a 0 probability. And then we get this absorbing thing happening again, where you multiply that very small but non-zero probability times infinity, and then it looks like being an atheist isn't, like, there's no reason to be a theist or practice a religion rather than be an atheist. And so I guess our sort of response to this is to say, well, look, I mean, maybe if you're just doing this sort of really basic anything times infinity is infinity kind of rule, then that would be right. But that just doesn't seem like the right kind of rule. And I think in the discussion with Cosmic Skeptic, I sort of made it sound like all mathematicians accept this rule and we should deny it, but that's actually not true. I think that's just sort of an intuition that people have, like, oh, 0.1 times infinity is infinity, 0.0001 times infinity is infinity. But like, I don't really think there's mathematical reason to accept that. But also in decision making, we definitely shouldn't accept that. And I often like to give a thought experiment where you have sort of 2 chances at getting infinity. Let's say there's 2 doors, and behind each door there's some chance at getting infinity. The first door, there's a 0.999 chance at getting this infinitely good thing, and the second door, there's a 0.001 chance at getting this infinitely good thing. And again, if we're doing this multiplication thing, you just multiply those probabilities by infinity. They're both infinite, so you should flip a coin. Or if I pay you $1 to choose the 0.01 door, you should, because they're both infinite. You can't, like, if I'm going to give you $1 to choose it, then you should, because they're the same. So basically what we say is, like, this just can't be right. Like, you should obviously go for the higher chance at getting something infinitely good than for the lower chance. And then we kind of apply this to the wager. And basically how this ends up working out is you should go for the religion you take to be most likely to be true, unless you think their afterlives are very different in terms of like rewards and punishments. So, I mean, there's more technical details there. We sort of use a method that involves limits and ratios to kind of make the math work out. But there's also other mathematical models too that you can kind of get the same result in. So I think there's a number of sort of ways you can make the math work out here. But the point is just that we shouldn't treat all infinities the same in decision theory. And I also want to add too, just really quick, you can also just do this all in terms of finite numbers. Like, if you're scared of infinities or you don't like them or you think they cause too many technical problems, you can just put in arbitrarily high finite numbers and still get the result that you should wager on God, even if you have really low credences. So that's another, like Mike Rhoda, for example, has a version of Pascal's wager that's just based on finite numbers. And I'm very open to that as well. I think that's another good route you could go.
Yeah, I think one of I think the use of mathematical infinities is always going to be difficult, and especially perhaps someone say like a William Lane Craig type apologist who's got some some of his very important works would be around defining infinity in a very specific way and its uses and applications. So for the type of Christian who would want to say defend a particular use of infinity for like thinks a Kalam cosmological argument is convincing, would they have to use like infinity in a kind of different way to be able to argue this? Would this argument be incompatible with that? Or obviously you've said there's the way around with you using just finite numbers that might, we can still get an output that we can use, but would that be incompatible with this other kind of view of infinity? Like you can't have an actual infinity, or it's always a potential, or rejecting certain conceptualizations and uses of infinity.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because actually a couple people have asked me that, and I would like to say it on YouTube so people know. So I actually think this whole argument is totally compatible with everything these, Craig's version of the Kalam and similar versions of the Kalam say about infinities, which is that I think you can make the whole argument work by only appealing to potential infinities. But I think we can still perfectly make sense of the idea that heaven is infinitely valuable, even if it's just this potential infinite. We're going to live forever, right? And you could say like you'll never get to that endpoint, but I think there's still a very totally reasonable sense in which you could say you're living forever, that's infinitely valuable, even if there's no actual infinities. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the view that there's no actual infinities, and you actually don't even need that strong of a premise to get the Kalam off the ground. You just need there's no like infinite sequences of events in the past or something. So I would my version of the Kalam, if I was to defend one, would rely on a weaker premise, because like I think there's an infinite number of numbers. I think God has an infinite number of beliefs. I think those are actual infinities, but either way, so that's one thing to say. But even if you reject that, I still think the infinity in Pascal's wager can totally be represented as a potential infinity, and that doesn't cause any issues for the problem.
Sorry, is that everything you wanted to say on that one?
No, I should have said that doesn't cause any issues for the argument, and I said problem. So sorry, just wanted to clarify that. Yeah.
So then, some people are quite concerned then about how do we know the numbers that we kind of plug into our equation here, and I think this is a similar. It's almost a similar concern that some people have about the kind of Bayesian probability used around the resurrection. It's like, of course, the evangelical Christian will come to it, and they get like a really high probability out, and then the skeptic scholar comes to it, and they get a low probability, and it's not very surprising. It seems like we can find the numbers that we want to kind of suit the outcome that we want. Now, in this case of kind of arguing Pascal's wager in this way, do we have to then be, is there like a regress of kind of probabilities of beliefs or something like that, or do we have to be really, how do we know the numbers that we're putting in are accurate, or what are those numbers? How certain can we be that they're the right ones we're putting in? How would you go about approaching that kind of response or concern people might have?
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, in a way, this is sort of a problem for decision theory in general, because decision theory sort of requires there to be at least some kind of approximation of like probabilities of ways the world could be, and then the value of certain states of affairs. So, I do want to say though that this depends on the version of the wager that you're trying to kind of go in for. So in certain versions of the wager, if you think most religions offer roughly the same like goodness of heaven and badness of hell, and I think that's like, I mean, maybe not most, but a lot of the big ones seem to kind of be similar. So if you think that, then you actually don't need to necessarily give me like a 0.9 or 0.8 or 0.7 or 0.63425 value. You can actually just rank the religions from most to least probable. So this would be the difference between like a cardinal ranking and an ordinal ranking, where a cardinal ranking is like giving it a specific number, like 0.9 or 0.73. And an ordinal ranking would be like the college football playoffs, where they're just ranked, even if like Alabama's way better than the next one comes in or whatever, it doesn't tell you how much better, it just ranks them in order. So if you think the rewards and punishments are roughly equal, then you can just give me an ordinal ranking, which says this is the most probable, second most probable, third most probable, whatever. And that's all you would actually need. So you wouldn't have to give specific numbers. But yeah, I do acknowledge, like, as you sort of compare various afterlives, things. Oh, and also, sorry, I should say, for this first ordinal ranking thing, that also needs to be, you're using an infinite version of Pascal's wager. So it would not apply in the same way for finite versions. So yeah, if you're going in for a finite version, or if you're doing more detailed comparisons of various afterlives, things are going to get more complicated. And I do think you could kind of approximate those values, even if they're not perfect. And as long as you kind of get them within a range, you could still get the right results. But it is going to be tricky in cases where maybe there's two religions that are close to being tied, but you don't know exactly how to assign those values. So yeah, I think that's potentially a difficult problem. And in that case, it might actually just be that they basically roughly have the same expected value for you. But yeah, I know that's not super satisfying, but it is kind of just an issue that all decision theory has to deal with. I mean, I guess the other thing I would say too is you can kind of, if you spend time like really looking at arguments for various religions, and really diving into the evidence, you can kind of approximate probabilities better that way. And you can actually even, like, if you want to be really intense about it, like assign probabilities to various premises of various arguments for certain religions, and then like do a bunch of math and like get the probability that way. So at least your kind of final probability assignment would be a little bit more informed than just kind of giving an off the cuff number. So that's another way you can do it too. But yeah, it's definitely a tricky problem, and it comes up all the time. And it's one reason that decision making is really hard, because we don't know how. It's like you're trying to figure out if you're going to buy car insurance. Well, what's the probability I get into a wreck? Like somewhere between 0.1 and 0.9. Like, I don't know. Like, I mean, yeah. So that's what it's just it's a hard feature of decision making in general, I think. Yeah.
Do you think I don't want this to derail the conversation too much, but do you think there's this notion of like has blicks, that people have like a blick towards certain things, like a kind of attitude perhaps about like that the steering in their car won't break or something like that, or do you think that is sort of a feasible way of thinking about how we actually this question might derail the conversation too much if I go, let's say, ignore going down that route for now, because I have a better question down there that so before we go down that route, the idea of using probability then in the first place, does that kind of rest on too many sort of shaky assumptions about, you know, how our mathematical models apply to reality, too many assumptions perhaps about metaphysics or physics? There's people questioning the use of probability in physics as a viable tool, and some people in the chat saying probability being built on a set of axioms. How do we know these axioms apply when we use Pascal's wager in this way? Is that something that you've kind of thought about much? Well, I guess so, but
yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I actually don't know a ton about the physics thing. I would like to learn, but I'm not a philosopher of physics, and
okay.
It's hard, like once you, I mean, this is a side note, but like once you start on an academic journey, it becomes so difficult to be broad. And yes, when I was like an undergrad, I loved physics, and I would like sit down with physics majors and like ask them questions, and I would love to still do that, but there's just so much to learn, and things have become so specialized that it's just hard for me to keep up with like what's going on in the latest in physics or whatever. So that's just maybe like a moment of honesty. So the question is, like, I mean, so there's the Kolmogorov axioms of probability that a lot of people take seriously. I mean, they're not perfect, and there's worries about using them as like perfect requirements of rationality. So the axioms imply that you should like assign probability 1 to all necessary truths, for example, but take an unproven mathematical theorem. It seems like since it's not proved, it's either necessarily true or necessarily false, right? Because mathematical claims are necessarily true or necessarily false, but since it's not proved, it seems like we should assign it probability 0.5 rather than 1 or 0. So there's questions about how we take these axioms and sort of use them to inform our beliefs, and that are really tricky, and a lot of epistemologists are kind of working on and interested in. But I guess, yeah, I'm interested in those too, and I have some thoughts on them. Some people are actually open to the idea of like fuzzy or imprecise probabilities as well, that sometimes we shouldn't just say like 0.63, but maybe we should have a probability over an interval or kind of a fuzzy probability. But yeah, I guess I don't know if these are specific problems for Pascal's wager, or they might be problems in general with sort of assigning probabilities that don't infect Pascal's wager in particular. And I mean, I guess my view on like the axioms thing is that we have these axioms of probability, but they just don't perfectly map onto kind of rationality, at least for agents like us. And so then some people think there's like different levels of rationality, one level of rationality for kind of like perfect reasoners or perfect Bayesian agents, and then kind of a lower level of rationality for people like us that are not perfect reasoners. So that's sort of one response, is to say these axioms are kind of latching on to a higher level of rationality. But if we're just saying like what credences or what probabilities should I have, what probability should I assign, we're going to have to do some kind of modification to approximate those. And there's been actually a couple books recently that have come out about this. One is by Julia Staffel, her recent book. I think it's I can't remember the title, but anyway, if you're interested in that, that would be, I mean, it's probably going to be a pretty high level academic thing, but the point is a lot of epistemologists are sort of interested in this and working on it.
So then I guess getting maybe away from the theoretical side of this argument, then maybe into the application a little bit. So say we think it's a good argument, and we come to the conclusion, but then there's several questions then about what next. I suppose one of which is an objection I'm sure you faced before, which is, can we choose our beliefs, and if we can't choose our beliefs, where does that leave us with the wager? And then there's a couple of, I suppose, theological questions as well about what does it mean, for example, to believe, or does it I think maybe Pascal's version is about acting religiously, which would be kind of anathema to a Protestant, maybe, especially the more kind of Ray Comfort types who would want to say, no, that, it's not about works, not works-based. Like, what does it really kind of mean? So the first kind of avenue to go around the kind of doxastic involuntarism, the can we choose what we believe, or we accept the outcomes of this argument, where does that kind of leave us?
Yeah, no, that's great. So I guess, and I've been actually working on a paper recently that touches on some of this stuff. So I'm glad you brought it up, because I wanted to talk a little bit about it. So so doxastic voluntarism, that's the thesis that we can control our beliefs. So at doxastic involuntarism, we can't control our beliefs. So a lot of philosophers think we can't control our beliefs, so they're doxastic involuntarists. And I guess, I mean, one thing to say is we should be clear about what we mean by control our beliefs, because they think we can't change our beliefs in the same way we can just like raise our hand at will. So we can't just change our beliefs like that. But maybe we have similar control over them to what we have over like our weight or blood pressure. Over a long period of time, we can study certain evidences and hang out with certain people and kind of influence our beliefs in the long term. And, there's probably debate about how successful this would be if you tried, of course, but most philosophers think we have at least some kind of control over our beliefs in that way, but we don't have a more direct sort of control. But what I actually have argued in this paper that I was talking about is that we have either direct or what I call semi-direct control over our beliefs. And let me explain what the difference between those first. So direct control would be like hand raising, like you can just do it immediately in kind of one action without it being interrupted by other things or anything.
Sure.
And then semi-direct control would be something like the control we have over making dinner, right? You can't just be like, boom, dinner's on the table, right? You can't like snap your fingers and Harry Potter it and have food on the table, but you can go to the fridge and cut the vegetables and put, cook the meat and, do all that. And then in kind of a process that is maybe interrupted by some other things, but still it's, we very clearly have control over whether we make dinner or not, even though it's not like hand raising, right?
Sure.
It's sort of this, it's more drawn out process, but it's very different than losing weight because it's not like this long-term goal that you would set out to achieve. You can kind of do it in a much shorter period of time and you have a more of a level of control over it, right? So that's direct and semi-direct. And so what I argue in this paper is that there are certain cases where our evidence makes it very obvious that something is either true or false. 1 + 1 = 3, obviously false. The earth is flat, obviously false. Sorry, flat earthers, 1 plus, basic 1 + 1 = 2, obviously true, etc. But there are other cases where it's not at all clear what exactly our evidence says about some proposition. So think about driving on the highway and driving towards sort of like a faraway sign. And let's say like maybe you're like in a golf cart or something, you're driving very slowly. Maybe initially you shouldn't really believe anything about what the sign says because it's not at all clear. And then when you get like a foot away from the sign, you can obviously see what it says. But somewhere in the middle there, you're going to kind of be at a place where you have pretty good evidence that it's like a stop sign, but not perfect evidence, for example, right? Your evidence is going to kind of underdetermine whether you should hold back and not believe anything or believe that the sign says this. And so what I argue is that in these cases where evidence is kind of ambiguous, we can either just form the belief directly, or we can do the cooking dinner thing and like focus on certain parts of our evidence, maybe reason in certain ways in order to kind of form the belief over a shorter process. So I also argue in this paper that at least maybe not all of us, but a lot of us are in this situation with respect to God's existence. Like there's a bunch of arguments that God exists. There's a bunch of arguments that God doesn't exist. This thing's been being debated by philosophers for forever. And I think a lot of us could probably be rational and being theists, agnostics, or atheists. That's not to say everyone. I mean, some people like, they just feel like I've experienced God. Like there's no way, like I'm like so sure God exists. And then maybe some people are like Matt Dillahunty's like, no, like atheism is definitely true. Like I'm so convinced. But I think a lot of us actually fall kind of somewhere in the middle where our evidence is, it could kind of go either way. It's sort of like a duck rabbit thing where those optical illusions or things that you can see in multiple ways, you can kind of go back and forth and see the world as created by God, see the world as not created by God. And so anyway, so basically in this paper, what I argue is that when our evidence is kind of ambiguous like this, we can either just choose to believe. And it's interesting that like I was looking up some conversion stories of people that described this exact thing. They sort of just went back and forth, God, no God, God, no God, and kind of just made a decision to believe. So that's sort of one case, or you could sort of do the making dinner thing where you kind of focus on certain parts of your evidence or reason in a certain way or think about certain arguments, and then that sort of results in the belief. And I guess I'll say one more thing about this. So when it comes to like questions about free will in general, I think this also parallels kind of what I'm saying here, that I think a lot of the actions that we take every day are actually kind of habitual. I mean, I'm not saying we don't exercise free will at all, but I just think when you really think about going throughout your day, a lot like you brush your teeth, you go to work, you come home, you eat dinner, maybe you work out, whatever, but you're not like, a lot of it's just kind of like, this is what I should do given like my reasons, but then there's cases where we're like really torn between two things. And these might happen sort of frequently, but sometimes like we're trying to choose between like two universities or something, or two career paths. It's like, should I be a lawyer or should I be a musician? And you're really torn. And some people working on free will think that these kind of big decision cases where you're really torn, those are the cases where we're really truly exercising free will.
Right. And
kind of what I'm saying is, I think that similar thing applies to belief. These cases where we're really torn between two ways the world could be, and then we just we choose one. And I think a lot of us are in that situation with respect to theism, but we can actually choose our beliefs. So that was really long-winded, partially because because I finished a paper on that, so I've been thinking about it a lot. Yeah. But that's sort of the idea. There's obviously more details in the paper, but yeah, the thought is that a lot of us can actually choose our theistic beliefs, and I think that's kind of cool. Now I forgot what your second question was.
Before going on to that second part of the question, okay. there's another one that sort of occurred to me while you were talking as well, which is that a lot of within the philosophy of religion, and specifically Christianity, that it's quite popular at the minute to be like a reformed epistemologist, or to have some kind of view that either the belief in God is properly basic, which I can see how that could be compatible with what you're saying here, but some people seem to take that sort of thing a step further and say it's kind of implanted in people in a way where, you know, it's not God causes people to have this belief, some kind of divine revelation via the Aquinas Calvin sensus divinitatis unit somewhere, and people figure out, you know, that that God exists through that interaction. Now, is this compatible with all those kind of views? Because it seems to say, you know, for us to reason that the argument works and then act as rational agents based on that conclusion is perhaps a bit different from you know, this strong sense of like personal experience or revelation in some sense through it. Is that something that you think is true, or is there a way of merging?
That's a great question. I mean, you can just think about like Paul on the road to Damascus in the Bible, right? Like Paul is just appeared to by Jesus and then converts, you know? So what do we say about those cases? And I guess two things. So the first is, again, this isn't a claim about all cases, right? So I definitely think Paul might just be one of those cases where it's just very obvious based on his evidence that God exists. And so then Paul wouldn't really fall in the category of people I'm talking about, where his evidence kind of underdetermines God's existence. So, you know, like if you've ever read like the medieval saints, like they just talk about these crazy religious experiences. And I think when reading those, I was just like, yeah, like if I had those experiences, I mean, it's just so obvious to them based on the fact they had those experiences that God exists, that I think those would sort of fall out of the scope of what I'm arguing for. Okay. And they might not have the kind of control that I'm talking about, because it's like for them, it's like trying to believe or to not believe 1 + 1 = 2. It's just so obvious, you know. Right. But I think the other thing to say is, I think a lot of people, at least I'm open to the possibility that people genuinely have experiences of God through the sensus divinitatis, and their sensus divinitatis is functioning. I guess I should say I don't consider myself like reformed in the Calvinist sense, but I'm open to the idea we have a sensus divinitatis and stuff. So I'm very open to that. But I think you could kind of deny that or explain that away. You know, I mean, a lot of people say I have religious experiences, but so do people in other religions, and maybe I'm just hallucinating, or maybe it's just wishful thinking. So I do think, depending on the case, you could still have those experiences, but nonetheless kind of find another explanation of those for your evidence. And I'm almost sure there's people that have had lots of experiences of God, but then still ended up deconverting for whatever reason. So I do think some people, like the sensus divinitatis isn't, I don't like to think of it as God like totally taking control of you and taking away your free will either. You know, God reveals himself, but I think that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have a choice anymore. So I would say the cases could fall into either of those categories, but that's a great question.
So then, yeah, what the original second part of that question was like, what the theological implications would be. So I think in the original, what Pascal's kind of driving at is like, you know, yeah, this is how a rational agent would act to develop the religious devotions, you know, going to church and so forth. You'd kind of over time you'd become disposed in that sort of way. But that seems at me to be perhaps at odds with what many Christians would talk of as, like the class of people who are saved. Well, that a good old southern preachers have a field day with that. With the there's many in this church right now who are So I'm just wondering what are the implications of this? Like we come to we come to conclude that, okay, it's a reasonable argument, it works, I'm a rational agent, I want to act that way, I am capable of acting that way within whatever free will means, or however much choice I have. But then what would the what are the theological implications? Is it acting a certain way, or is it like, is it believing a certain set of propositions about the world, or what does it kind of mean exactly at that point, connecting it up to theology?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't think one I've talked much about yet in any interviews, really. So so I guess I don't at all think about this as like earning your salvation or like working your way to God or anything like that. The way I think about it is, there's a point in your life in which you kind of make a commitment. You make a commitment to God. And that commitment you could call faith. You could say that's the commitment to kind of pursue a relationship with God or go to church, or, whatever is involved in the commitment. I would say that's like a faith commitment. And then, kind of spelling it out, at least in like the way a lot of Protestants think about it, because you have that commitment then kind of results in the actions that we were talking about, like going to church and doing good things and being a moral person and all of that, right? But it's not that those actions are what saves you. What it is the commitment itself. And then I guess we can debate about, like, do we want to give like a Calvinist understanding of like where that commitment comes from, or a more Arminian one, or a Molinist one, or whatever. I don't necessarily want to take a stand on that today.
Sure.
But this kind of Pascalian thing, it's more just trying to get clear on what's required for that commitment. And it's interesting that in James it says, like, even the demons believe and shudder, right? And so I think that at least points to the idea that just believing in God wouldn't be enough. And I think that's why we have this desire component to faith that I talked about at the very beginning. Faith involves sort of a desire for the thing to be true, not just a belief. But part of what I think people like in this literature are really interested in is the idea that if you lose a bunch of evidence, so you can't believe anymore, could you still be rational in continuing that commitment? And it's not saying that continuing that commitment is what saves you, but it's just saying maybe there are other ways to make the commitment rather than just straight up forming a belief. And in terms of, I guess, like theological stuff, the word used in the Bible is pistis, for faith. And there's a lot of interesting evidence that pistis means something more like trust than it means just straight up belief. I think the James passage is one that it's not just belief in the English sense, because even demons believe, right? But there's a lot of evidence that, in Mark, the man whose daughter was healed, I think said,
Jairus?
I think that's who it was. Jairus, yeah. I think he said, I believe, but help my unbelief. And so that side kind of indicates there's a level at which he didn't believe, and that's the kind of person that I think I'm thinking about here, is this kind of person that really does have really serious doubts and doesn't know what to do with these arguments. And I want to say, like, you can continue in that commitment. That doesn't mean you're earning your salvation. It just means that you have this commitment, and doubt doesn't have to force you to get out of it. So I hope that kind of clears that up a little bit. It's not a claim about what's necessary for salvation. It's just a claim about what underlies the rationality of a commitment. And you could give a totally Calvinist, read on what I just said, but you're not saying you're earning your salvation, or this is, salvation by works, or anything like that. So
there's a few questions then that have come in from the chat throughout that I've not had time to get to. I don't want to eat into too much of your time, though. Are you okay to go through a few of them?
Yeah, sure. Probably like 15 more minutes or so.
Okay. Yeah. Great.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. So, I'll maybe try and stick to ones that are more relevant to what we've just been talking about first. So rather than using the sensus divinitatis, what are your thoughts on using testimony as a valid method for forming properly basic beliefs? And then Randall Rousey given as an example there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that happens all the time, actually. There's a lot of things. One example I've used before is your mom's like, I had eggs for breakfast. And you just believe her and you don't go check the trash or write out a premise conclusion form. We believe things on the basis of testimony all the time. There's so many things that we believe exist that we've never seen with our own eyes, and we're just sort of taking other people's word for it. And you can be a skeptic of testimony. You can say, no, testimony is not a good source of knowledge unless it's independently checked by your own observations. But then you're going to be giving up a lot of your beliefs, like beliefs about all these different places in the world that you've never traveled to, beliefs like the one I just gave. Your mom says I had eggs for breakfast. I think it would just be really hard to get around in the world if we didn't believe people. You couldn't really ask people for directions. So I think testimony is a really important source of basic beliefs. Basic being you don't have to additionally have an argument for them. You can just believe a testifier. Does that mean we should believe all testimony no matter what? Of course not. I mean, that would be, yeah. If you know someone's lying, you know someone's biased, you shouldn't believe them, right? But just the point is that testimony is a good source of evidence, and to deny that would be to basically go into some pretty intense skepticism where you can't believe or know quite a few things.
So then another question from slightly earlier on was, how should we incorporate the eternal destinies of our loved ones into our decision making? Seems like we have options: convert for them, try to love them less, etc.
Yeah, wait, what was the last thing? Try to what them less?
Try to love them less. I guess if they're not going to, what they're implying there is if they're not going to be saved, yeah.
That I don't recommend that one.
Or the Aquinas approach of that the beatitude of the saved shall increase with loved ones burning. I don't know if we want to go with that.
Yeah, I'm definitely not one of those. Aquinas was right about everything people. They exist, but I'm not one of them. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think one thing it shows is that there's actually interesting versions of Pascal's Wager that don't even have to do with yourself. They have to do with kind of other people or your preferences for other people or that kind of thing. But yeah, I do think this is an important consideration that could motivate us to, care about, we should care about the eternal destiny of our loved ones. We shouldn't love them less, but we should do what we can to kind of encourage them to do what we think is needed for salvation. So I guess, I'm very open to sort of a version of Pascal's Wager that involves other people. The other thing I think I do want to note here as maybe a caveat is it's not always the case that the most efficient way to sort of, I don't know if you want to use the word evangelize, but is just to kind of like blatantly and like almost like abruptly just be like, you should believe in God. Da, 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 da. I actually think it's a lot more efficient to kind of just build relationships with people and like show them that you're a virtuous and kind person. And I mean, I'm not saying you should never bring it up, but I think a lot of evangelism happens through actions and not just saying like, here's all these things that you should believe. So I also think some of the ways that people do evangelism I would say are pretty inefficient and probably are pushing people away rather than making them think that, having faith or living a life of Christian commitment is attractive. So I would also say that as well. I'm not necessarily advocating for all of the current kinds of evangelism that go on in the world.
So a question that came up earlier in the conversation as well was, what are your thoughts on God existing without hell, or perhaps without eternal conscious torment? So maybe more towards the universalism of someone like David Bentley Hart, or what would that sort of, if that were true, would that kind of nullify the arguments that are being made here from Pascal's Wager point of view?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so there's two views. One view would be an annihilationist view, which says that there's no hell, but people are just people that, don't have faith or don't believe or whatever the criteria is, just cease to exist after they die. And then another view would be a view on which everyone goes to heaven. So on the first view, I think clearly there's a reason to wager if you prefer going to heaven to be annihilated, to being annihilated, which I think, given that heaven is this infinitely good place, you should. So I think if you're an annihilationist, Pascal's Wager will definitely still have purchase for you. If you're a universalist, I guess there's sort of two things to note. So the first thing to note is that the wager can actually still have purchase for you as long as you don't assign universalism probability 1, or as long as you're not 100% sure the universalism is true. So you could even say, I believe universalism, but there's some chance I'm wrong. And because you think there's some chance that annihilationism or hell is the case, that could still sort of motivate you to wager. So, and again, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, because of the way we're supposed to sort of assign probabilities rationally, something like universalism is true because that's not a necessary truth. That would be like a contingent truth. That's not something that people would say you should rationally give probability 1 or be 100% sure about. So that's one thing to say. Even if you are 100% sure that everyone goes to heaven, a final way to sort of get something like Pascal's Wager off the ground would be to say that there's like levels of heaven, and that some people sort of have a better heaven, or have a better reward, or whatever, experience the beatific vision more, whatever you want to put in the heaven slot. Some people experience that more than others, and so then you might think, well, we should do things sort of maximize our chance at getting to the better heaven, even if everyone gets in at some level. So that's sort of the third thing you can say.
Sure. So then the next question, I'm just thinking, so there's three more questions. One, I won't take any, if anyone's in the chat, by the way, I won't take any more. So sorry if you've not had time to get yours in. So are we required to know someone is lying or biased in order to dismiss a personal testimony?
No. First of all, I think you don't have to know it. You could just believe it or rationally believe it. And even if you don't know it, you could still dismiss their testimony on that basis. I'm trying to think. But so take a case where you have very good evidence for something. Like, let's say you have very good evidence. I'm trying to think that the meeting on Friday is at 3, like you saw an email about it. And then your coworker is like, oh, it's at 2. But your coworker, like, the meetings are usually at 2, and your coworker might have just missed the email. You could dismiss their testimony, even though they're not really biased or lying. They're just wrong. They're just confused, and you have really good evidence for your own belief, right? So I guess cases where someone doesn't have a certain piece of information that you do have, or a case where you just have really, really, really good evidence for something, those would also be cases where you could dismiss someone's testimony. Testimony isn't my main area of research, so I don't know if I could give like, here's all the cases and then you should believe testimony in every other case. But yeah, there would be more cases other than just those two.
And then a more broad kind of question then was, what are your thoughts on the current state of the philosophy of religion? Where do you think there's kind of major progress to be made?
Ooh, that's a fun question. Yeah, I think philosophy of religion, there's a lot of really cool stuff going on right now with philosophy of religion. And in kind of as a result of Plantinga's influence, it's just an area of research that a lot of stuff is happening in right now. So this might sound a little biased because I work on this, but I think faith is one area that a lot of people are really interested in, and a lot of papers have been coming out about faith, and I guess about hope too, and kind of what those are, and how those might be rational or might not be rational, how they relate to like virtues, that kind of thing. So I think that's a big area a lot of people in philosophy of religion are interested in. But I think a lot of the classic questions are people are still working on a lot too, especially the problem of evil and the problem of hiddenness. I think like Mike Ray just wrote some books on the problem of hiddenness. A lot of people I think the problem of evil is just one of those things that it's just going to be around for a while. A lot of people are very interested in that. And some people are working on too, like some really interesting stuff, like Michelle Panchuk is working on like religious trauma and kind of how that relates to the problem of evil and the rationality of deconversion. And I think that's super interesting too. And one area that I think is really fruitful for further research is like looking at the way philosophy relates to other questions, like in psychology or sociology or these other disciplines, and kind of thinking about how philosophy of religion can progress by being like interdisciplinary as well.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of cool stuff going on. Yeah, it's a great question.
So then the last question, and I think this is a bit of a joke, and I'm not sure if it's gonna lower the tone of the whole discussion, if it's the right one to finish off. It's how does Pascal's Wager interact with a Nigerian prince email scam?
Oh yeah, no, that's nice. No, I mean, no, it's a good question though, because it's related to this issue that's called Pascal's mugging. And I don't know, I mean, I don't want to like be too long-winded about it, but the idea is that a mugger comes up to you in a dark alleyway and he doesn't have a weapon. So you're like, well, what are you doing? I'm not giving you my wallet. And he's like, but if you give me your wallet today, I'm going to deposit $1 trillion in your bank account tomorrow, right? And so it's like, well, if you're a Pascalian, it's like, you know, the probability that he's telling the truth is really, really low, but look, $1 trillion, right? And so there's actually a famous paper by Nick Bostrom where he basically is like, yeah, you shouldn't wager, and you also shouldn't give the mugger your wallet. And so, yeah, if you want to, we have in my paper that's called Salvaging Pascal's Wager, we have a detailed response to this. And since it's kind of the last question, I won't go into all the details. But basically, the crux of our response is we try to argue that, yes, you should not give the mugger or the Nigerian prince your wallet or your money. But there's important differences about Pascal's Wager that make that make this fall into a different category than Pascal's Wager. And basically how we sort of motivate this is we say, look, there is a lot of cases where there's a small probability at getting something really good, and it seems like we should take that risk. Like if you have a really serious illness and there's a medicine that could cure you, but there's only a really small probability and it's like really expensive, let's say, it still could be rational for you to get that medicine, even if it's really expensive, because there's a really good chance of you getting cured, right? So this is like a puzzle, right? It's like some cases there's a really low probability of something good and we shouldn't take that risk. In other cases, there's a really low probability of something good and we should take that risk. And so then the challenge would be to say, well, what divides these cases? But at least the point of this response is it's not obvious that Pascal's Wager would be on the irrational side of these cases rather than the rational side of these cases. So, you know, it might have to do with like how high the probability is. That's one potential answer. Then you would get a version of the wager that would say you should only wager if your probability is at least high enough, you know, and maybe that's okay. That's still controversial, right? But it might also have to do with the reward structure. There's different sort of ways of thinking about it. So go check out the paper for more details on that. But yeah, that's a fun question, and it's a very relevant objection to Pascal's Wager.
And would you be able to link me then, just send me the links to that paper, also your paper on Pascal's Wager and anything else you think might be right? Just because a few people in the chat throughout were kind of saying, I want to look at some of these probabilities, work through the numbers and things myself and see what happens. So yeah, if you could send me those, and then I'll pop them in the description for people down below.
Yeah, absolutely. I just really quick, my website is liz-jackson.com. So you can go there and there's a research page that has all my papers, like there's abstracts and stuff, so you can kind of see what they're about and you can download them. But I also have a page that's like public philosophy, where I have interviews and blog posts and podcasts and stuff like that. And I'll put this interview there too. And so you can also go there if you're like, I don't really want to read a paper, but I just want to like learn more about this topic or something, then that's a good page. So, but yeah, I'm also happy to send you those links as well, and we can put them in the description. So yeah.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope you've had the chance to kind of articulate your points as clearly as you wanted to, given the time, and maybe be interested in coming back on to talk about some of these things further in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun, great questions, and I really enjoyed it. And it was fun to both talk about things that I've talked about a little bit, but also you sort of brought a new angle on some of them, and we were able to talk about some things that haven't come up also. So yeah, thanks so much.
Awesome.